Alright, a little bit about carbohydrate loading, is it as it is called. And in this what presentation or whatever this is, like, I'm talking about carbohydrate loading as if meaning just that you eat carbohydrates before you work out. So that's that. And first we have effect of carbohydrates. Let's look at these a little bit. First study we have here is less cortisol and more muscle. And here is the study. And if we go down on the study a little bit, they compared in the study of the they gave them like carbohydrates and then a non-caloric placebo and 6% carbohydrate solution. And what they found in this study is that the carbohydrate source resulted in a significant blunting of the cortisol response. 7% with carbohydrates and 99% with placebo. Meaning that with this carbohydrate solution, they only got 7% of the cortisol elevation than what they got with the non-caloric alternative. Compared to that, it was just 7%, which is quite a lot. And then they also concluded that weight training exercise with carbohydrate ingestion result in significant greater gains in both type 1 and type 2 muscle fiber area than weight training exercise alone. And here they show what they mean. So it was 20% in both type 1 and type 2 muscle fibers. So that is quite significant, I would say. So here is all we can take from this study. Less cortisol and more muscle. Then let's go to the next study. Less cortisol. Here. Let's look at this study now. They concluded that this data indicates that carbohydrate and essential amino acid ingestion during a single bout of resistance exercise suppressed the exercise-induced cortisol response. Well, that's kind of significant too. So it means that carbohydrate intake, in this study also essential amino acid intake, blunted, meaning decreased the cortisol response caused by exercising. So that's interesting. Let's go to another study now. It also concludes the same. Here's the study. Then we scroll a little bit down. We also found significant and inverse linear association between dietary carbohydrate and log salivary cortisol. So again, carbohydrate intake blunted the cortisol response. So less cortisol also from this study. And then I have a couple of studies here still about carbohydrate effect. This study, first study we look at here, concluded that you were able to do more work with carbohydrates. Second study here concluded that significantly less work was performed on the low carbohydrate compared with high carbohydrates. So basically they are saying just the same thing, that high carbohydrates you were able to do more work. Alright. And then the last here, basically just the result of this investigation indicates that the consumption of carbohydrate beverage can attenuate the decrease in muscle glucose associated with isokinetic resistance exercise, but does not enhance the performance of isokinetic leg exercise. So what you can take away from this is that it also ingesting carbohydrates before workout will keep your glucose level high, but also that if you do carbohydrate loading for the first time, let's say tomorrow, don't expect you to get stronger from the first time. You know, it's accumulative. The benefit is accumulative, meaning that in that first study we looked at, where they concluded that it results in 12 weeks. Here it says in 12 weeks they did it, and during that 12 weeks they got 20% more muscle fiber area. So in 12 weeks it caused this, not in one session. So now that we look at here, it's not one session increased. You don't get in one session stronger, but in accumulative through your workout in long time, you will gain more muscle with carbohydrate loading than you would gain if you don't. Alright, and then the fourth study, you were able to do greater total work and less drop in OP, power output. So you were able to continue to produce this high level of power longer with carbohydrate loading, with high intensity exercise, which lifting weights is. Alright, so here is the science a bit about carbohydrate loading and what kind of effect it's caused in the body. And then let's look at the cortisol a bit more. Like from this study these three studies, we could conclude that carbohydrate loading lowers cortisol during your workout, which otherwise the workout would cause to be elevated. So okay, let's look at bit these to understand why your body is elevating cortisol. So here we have this, and this is taken from this source. So it's a PubMed source. It's a science source also, and this is out of Wikipedia, this picture. So let's look at this picture here. So cortisol and protein metabolism. What does cortisol do? It causes protein degradation in connective tissue and smooth muscle and resting skeletal muscle. It also causes anti-anabolic activity in connective and muscle tissue. Well, anti-anabolic means the opposite of anabolic, and anabolic means building up. So it means staring down activity in connective and muscle tissue. Well, why is your body doing this? Well, it does it to produce free amino acids. But where does it need free amino acids, you may ask? Well, here we have, the answer is here in gluconeogenesis. But let's look at this. This is the process of gluconeogenesis. This is taken from Wikipedia. So, in this process of gluconeogenesis, your body needs amino acids here and here. So it's breaking down muscle to provide amino acids to the process of gluconeogenesis here. So that through this process of gluconeogenesis, it can produce glucose. So the process of gluconeogenesis just means a process which produces glucose. It's a glucose producing process in your body. So cortisol breaks down muscles so that in the muscles you get amino acids, since proteins are made out of amino acids, so that these amino acids can be given to this process of gluconeogenesis where your body can produce glucose so that your body has glucose. So now you may understand that when you don't eat carbohydrates, your body elevates glucose so that it can break down muscle, so that it can produce amino acids, so that the amino acids can be used in the process of gluconeogenesis to produce glucose, which your body can then use to move around. So muscles need glucose. So this is how your body produces glucose if you don't give it carbohydrates. But if you give your body carbohydrates as a pre-workout, none of this will happen because it already has carbohydrates, so it doesn't have to activate the gluconeogenesis in the liver. So it doesn't need to break down muscle, so it doesn't need to produce cortisol. So all this is avoided. All right. So let's move on to the next slide. So I just made a claim that cortisol triggers the process of gluconeogenesis in your body in this style. So let's look here that is it actually true what I claimed. So here we have a PubMed article, Physiology of Cortisol. So here it reads, in the liver, high cortisol levels increase gluconeogenesis and decrease glucogen synthesis. So as I claimed that cortisol triggers the gluconeogenesis. So it's true. This is what science also says. So I was not bullshitting on that. So let's look at now this whole thing that we can take out of this. Let's recap this. Without carbohydrates, no bread, cortisol is elevated. Muscle breakdowns occurs due to cortisol. Amino acids are released from this muscle breakdown. Amino acids are taken into liver where through gluconeogenesis your body converts them to glucose so that you can move. Alright, then let's look out with carbohydrates. With bread, you get glucose from bread and you can use that glucose from bread to move. You see that with this process, there was no muscle breaking down. And hence it's understandable how with carbohydrates, in 12 weeks, you might end up with 20% more muscle tissue. Because you are avoiding this process of glucose generation. Because you are giving it the glucose it needs. Directly, without having to break down muscle. Alright, well this is all nice and interesting. Let's move on. So this was function of cortisol. Alright, Then the next thing. Let's look at a little bit about carbohydrate types and sources. So here we have a Wikipedia page about sugar. And what we're gonna take away from this is that we have 3 types of single sugars, which are also called monosaccharides, which include glucose, fructose, and galactose. Okay, that is what we take away from this page. Let's move on to the next page. So here is a little bit of examples on what different food contains. And let's remember that glucose, fructose, and galactose were the main monocarbohydrates, meaning the simple sugars. And from these 3, all other carbohydrates are made out of. So first we have table sugar, which is sucrose, which is made out of glucose molecule together with fructose molecule. So that makes sucrose. Then we have lactose, which is glucose molecule together with galactose molecule. And then here we have an example of yogurt, non-lactose, lactose-free yogurt. Like milk has lactose, but lactose-free yogurt doesn't have lactose. So what does it have? It has 50% of the carbohydrate it has is glucose, and 50% carbohydrate it has is galactose. So you can see that the lactose-free product just means that the lactose has been cut, so that these molecules has just been cut, so that these what make up lactose are there individually and not bind together to form the lactose. All right, and then a little bit more examples. We have honey here, and honey is 54% fructose and 46% glucose. And then there is also sucrose, which is glucose and fructose. The rest of it is the little amount. And then we have syrup. Syrup is actually 38% sucrose and 33% glucose and 29% fructose. And these numbers are from this website, if you're wondering. And then we have example apples as a fruit. Like people say that fructose is a fruit sugar, but actually there is a lot more sugars than just fructose. Like there is 53% of the sugar in apples is fructose, 30% is sucrose, which is fructose together with fructose and glucose together, and then there is 17% just as pure glucose. And then let's look at these starches. Like also from this, what you can take away is that you also had the glucose, fructose, galactose, but then you have also starches. So like, maybe that was a bad way to put it, but you have starches which are not monocarbohydrates. These were the monocarbohydrates, but then you have carbohydrates which are combinations of these monocarbohydrates. And there is starches, lactose, maltose, and then there is sucrose, which was the table sugar, and lactose was the milk sugar, and maltose, and starches. And starches are like potatoes and stuff. So, right? So, these are also what we can take away from this page. So, let's go look at these a bit more. So, sucrose was the table sugar, lactose was the milk sugar, and then starches are the like what you usually eat as a, or they are starchy food, like grains here, potatoes, corn, and rice. Like these are like the main starchy foods. But as you can see, there is still some amount of fructose and glucose in these products too. Like only some of these grains, they don't contain any fructose. And as you can see, starch here is pure glucose. It's just a super long chain of individual glucose molecules joined together. And the rice seems to have the more pure starch from all of these. And then there comes the grains. But anyhow, here is a little bit insight into what foods are made out of. And let's go. So here was the little bit on that. And then let's go here. Glycemic index. The section of my little presentation. And here we have the glycemic index Wikipedia page. And what basically it just means is that they have taken foods and they have measured that after 2 hours the glucose level in the blood after 2 hours they have measured of various foods, and from this they have made out of chart. And this chart that they have made out of, they have standardized it with the glucose, so that they have given glucose the arbitrary value of 100, and they have put everybody else's glucose elevating level relationship to glucose. Alright, so glucose has 100 glycemic index value, meaning that you glucose in your blood 2 hours after you consume the food. So that is glycemic index, means the glucose value in your blood 2 hours after you ate the food. Alright, so these are given values ranging from 0 to 100 and bit over it. But glucose has been given the value of 100, and other foods are just made to fit that number. Alright, so that is all glycemic index means. And here you can see in this picture a little bit about how your blood sugar moves around. With 15 minutes after you consume the food, with half an hour it seems to be the highest after half an hour, and then it starts to drop and it goes a little bit below baseline, and then it climbs over there. Alright, so that's two things you can take away from this, is that what the definition of glycemic index, and then a little bit about how your blood sugar moves around when you eat something. Alright, let's go to the next thing, which is a little bit of examples of various food and regarding the glycemic index. So here I have a little bit of examples, and here are in the upper corner little bit of examples of things which are not on the list. So honey, maple syrup, table sugar, and pancakes. You can see that these, even though they may taste sweet, they are not very high on the glycemic index. And if you remember what glycemic index means, it's just your blood glucose levels 2 hours after you consume the food. Alright? So you can see, even though honey and syrup may taste very sweet, they do not elevate your blood glucose levels that much after 2 hours of consuming the food. But instead you can see that white bread and all these starchy foods that has starch, which is poor glucose joined together, they're very high on the glycemic index. But you may ask that why then is honey and maple syrup so sweet, even though they don't elevate your blood glucose so much? So here is a little bit on that on the right side upper corner of this thing. And there is the individual glycemic index values of these monocarbohydrates, these simple sugars. And as you can see, glucose had the 100 value, which was arbitrarily given to it from the Wikipedia page. Then we have galactose and fructose, and they are very low, actually. Fructose has only 19 and galactose has 25. Meaning that if you just put pure fructose, You 2 hours after consuming it, your body glucose level is only 20% from what it would be if you consumed glucose. That's interesting, isn't it? Because why does the fructose products then taste so good? Like if you remember from this, if we go back here all the way, here you can see that honey and maple syrup are very high on fructose. So they taste very sweet. There is also a correlation, you could say, with fruits that taste very sweet and which are high on fructose. Like you can see, very high on fructose, these foods, and they, I would argue, are the sweetest tasting foods on this list. Well, let's go back here and let's look at this third presentation picture here, which is the sweetness of various compounds. A chart. Okay, glucose has the sweetness of about 0.8, whereas fructose has the sweetness of 0.75. So you can see that fructose is almost, it's 2 times as sweet as glucose is. Isn't that kind of interesting? Like, your body senses fructose as 2 times as sweet as glucose, even though glucose elevates your body glucose levels 5 times as much as fructose. Because fructose is, your body will convert fructose into glucose in the liver. So it is a more difficult process to process fructose than glucose for your body. But your tongue doesn't taste it. It just tastes it as sweet. Alright? So let's look at a bit about then next fructose, in the difference in fructose compared to glucose regarding what we already established, that carbohydrates lower cortisol. So let's look at here about this study. We can see that from here that furthermore, fructose in the brain, either from fructose uptake via the blood-brain barrier or from endogenous formation from glucose via the polyloid pathway, stimulates an increased release of cortisol, causing hepatic gluconeogenesis, leading to overall insulin resistance and further body fattening. So we can see that actually fructose causes cortisol elevation from this study, which was interesting since we already established that carbohydrate intake blunts the cortisol response. So it seems like fructose does the opposite than what typically carbohydrates do. So let's recap a little bit here about what I was telling about. And here is my reasoning behind why this study which we looked here, why does this happen? Well, here is my theory why fructose actually causes elevated cortisol, whereas glucose doesn't. Alright, so if we go back into this presentation and here, as you could, if we remember that glucose elevated your body glucose levels 5 times as much as fructose after 2 hours of consuming it, which was the glucosamic index. Now you can see that if you eat your pre-workout from fructose, your body does not get the glucose it needs as much as if you would have eaten starches or other foods which has poor glucose in it. So it may be that the mechanism by which fructose elevates cortisol is because fructose, since it is metabolized in the liver, here, the mechanisms of this. Glucose goes direct to the muscles, galactose goes to liver, and there it converts to glucose, and then it goes to muscle. And fructose is also taken to liver, where it converts to glucose, where it's then taken to muscle. Because the reaction for getting galactose to glucose and fructose to glucose is so much longer than glucose alone. It means that your body and muscles do not get the glucose they need from a carbohydrate source, which is mainly fructose. So it has to elevate that cortisol, because it has to trigger that gluconeogenesis chain, which leads to breakdown of muscle, but eventually where you get the amino acids to build the glucose it needs. So this might be the mechanism why fructose leads to cortisol elevation, because it's like you can see from this maybe. Here we have glucose value in the blood caused by glucose and sweetness of glucose. And there is galactose, glucose elevation in the blood and sweetness of it. And fructose, glucose elevation in the blood and the sweetness of it. As you can see, as I have written here, fructose is deceptively sweet regarding how little glucose it provides for the muscles. This reality could mean that your body might still end up producing cortisol, so that the body would have adequate glucose level even though you used a fructose heavy pre-workout, like for example maple syrup. So that's why I would argue that maple syrup pancake diets might not be so ideal, because it triggers your brain to think that you ate something very sweet and hence you have glucose, where in reality your muscles do not get the glucose they need. So they may end up trigger the gluconeogenesis through elevating cortisol, which then forces your body to go through this chain where muscle breakdown happens, which is something you don't want, since muscle breakdown isn't good for building muscle. It's kind of self-defeating to work out through a process where muscle breakdown occurs, which happens without carbohydrates, and also if the main monocarbohydrate you're ingesting is fructose. So here was my little presentation, or why the maple syrup and honey diets are not ideal pre-workout, and why I personally prefer foods which are high on the glycemic index, because all it means is that your body will have adequate blood glucose levels 2 hours after you digest the food. So high glycemic index isn't bad, as you can see that these foods which people might think are high on glycemic index aren't high on our glycemic index. But white bread, oatmeal, potatoes, and things like that, they are actually high on the glycemic index, which you would think are healthy food. Like these are just bare foods. There is nothing added to these. This is just starches. Like if you go here and we return to this, like here, you can see that grains and potatoes and corn and rice, they are just starch, which is just pure glucose. And that's why it elevates your blood glucose level, because it's pure glucose. It doesn't have to convert the fructose or galactose into glucose in your liver. So your body has a lot easier time of getting that glucose out of these foods, than it has with getting it out of these foods. So it makes sense to consume these foods as a pre-workout, because starch is what you want, because glucose is what you want, because you don't want to trigger the cortisol response, because cortisol response is anti-anabolic, meaning breaking down of muscle to get those amino acids out of the muscle so that it could use those amino acids in the gluconeogenesis, where it tries to produce that missing glucose, which you did not give it, since you gave it fructose or galactose, which the body doesn't directly can use, because it first have to convert them into glucose in your liver. So this was a little bit about this issue. I hope somebody could get something out of it. And yep.